The 7 Unitarian Universalist principles begin with these words. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And that is the first of our 7 principles, which we know so well. But there is a move afoot, a group called the First Principle Project Consortium, that would like to change this wording to read, the inherent worth and dignity of every being. So what is this consortium? What do they want to do? Why do they want to change this wording? And is it something worth considering? Is it something worth us considering as a congregation in this association? The Unitarian Universalist Animal Ministry hired the Reverend Laura Kim Joyner, who is both a Unitarian Universalist minister and a veterinarian who specializes in avian veterinary medicine and has done a lot of work down in Central America in bird sanctuaries. They hired her to be the consultant and facilitator of this project. So she is the lead on this First Principle project. And the consortium consists of sponsoring organizations and sponsoring congregations. And it's in its infancy. It's only been around a couple years. And right now there are 4 sponsoring organizations. Obviously, the UU Animal Ministry, the UU Buddhist Fellowship, CUPS, which is the Covenant of UU Pagans, and the Food Justice Ministry. These are all Unitarian Universalist ministries. 4 congregations have officially voted to support the change of this wording. The Palomar Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in California, the UU Congregation of South County in Rhode Island, First Unitarian of Hinsdale in Illinois, and the Social Justice Council of the First Unitarian Church of Portland, Oregon. Okay, so that's the technical stuff. Now we're going to get down to the gist of what this is all about. But I wanted to lay out the organizational side first. Why would these people, and perhaps us, why would we want to change the wording of the first principle to make it broader? Because right now, just saying persons is not only very broad in scope, but in some cases somewhat controversial. Plenty of people in our congregation, and we've discussed this over the years, have said, you know, I don't know that I actually do believe that. And we always come back to Hitler. It's always Hitler. Or maybe Osama bin Laden or Stalin, but it's always Hitler. Hitler has worth and dignity? Really? Hitler? There's not a single molecule of worth and dignity in that man's body, or there wasn't. And I just can't buy into this concept of the worth and dignity of every person. Now, when we're dealing with the first principle, remember, it's meant to be broad, it's meant to be individually interpreted. It's not a hard and fast rule that you must swear to uphold if you want to be a member, and you must swear to abide by it in every breath you take. And the UU police will be at your door if you don't really believe this. That's not the point of the first principle. It is a covenant. Remember, this is in the bylaws. You're laughing at my joke. Love good audience. This is in the bylaws for the Unitarian Universalist Association. And this is a covenant of the congregations that we are going to promote these things. But it never says individuals must swear that they believe all these things. But as a congregation, this is how we function. But the other thing here to remember as we deal with this is these words will be individually interpreted. So what does worth and dignity of every person mean? It's going to boil down to what you think it means. And when I say what you think it means, I literally mean you. Not just some generic vague you, but you, each one of you. You have to interpret the meaning of these words. And you may find they leave you cold, regardless of how you interpret them. And that's fine, because we're not out to force you into molds. So no one is required to swear an oath of allegiance to these principles or a particular interpretation. And we're not going to pry and dig and probe and poke and say, do you really believe in the worth and dignity of every person? That's not the point. It is a tool. Think of it this way. It is a tool to help each one of us, each congregation, each member of these congregations, each attendee, to look at their lives and determine how best to live. That's why it's there. As Doug understands these words, and this is the interpretation according to Doug, as Doug uses in Doug's life, and you can all blow it off and ignore it and say I'm full of hot air, that's fine. But when I look at these words, the worth and dignity of each individual refers to how I treat others, not an inherent quality in the others. So it's not about an inherent quality in Hitler. It's an inherent quality in the people who had to deal with someone like that. So for even the most vile and reprehensible person, there are ways I hope that I will always behave. No one should be tortured. No one should be humiliated, nor made sport of for my enjoyment or my betterment. Criminals are still held to account, but jails should be safe. Trials should be fair. Representation should be fair. Punishment should be commensurate with the crime and applied evenly throughout a society regardless of wealth or color of skin or your standing in society. No one is treated differently because of the color of their skin, their gender identification, their sexual orientation, their nationality, or their religious beliefs or lack thereof. And it is possible to believe in the worth and dignity of every person and still hold people accountable for their actions. I find no problem in my life, in my understanding, with the wording of the first principle. I don't find it to be naive or unrealistic if I look at it as a tool to help me examine how I live. And in that sight, I think it's great. It provides a way for me to think more deeply about how I approach my interactions with other people. So why change the wording? Why go from person to being? Well, here are a couple of reasons from the publications put out by the First Principle Project. First of all, it changes the conversation. It invites Unitarian Universalists, as many as possible, into a conversation about religious, spiritual, and ethical aspects of living in a multi-species world. Because we do live in a multi-species world. We don't live in a world populated only by persons. And if we live in this world, and if we believe in the interconnected web of all existence, another one of our principles, then maybe the wording should be changed. How do we understand reality? How do we understand the nature of ourselves? And what is our response to these understandings? Secondly, the change in the wording might provoke a changing in ourselves. It might guide Unitarian Universalists as they seek to improve their ability to participate in and sustain these discussions, reflect more deeply and broadly about what it means to be compassionate in a multi-species world. What does compassion mean to other life forms besides persons? And as we're thinking about this, it augments our faith development, deepens our spiritual lives, and empowers our compassionate behavior at the individual and collective level. So those are a couple of proposed reasons to do this from the First Principle Project. And I think those are pretty good ones. Changing the first principle, changing that wording, forces us to think outside of the human-centered box we always find ourselves in, or usually find ourselves in. But it allows room for each one of us to wrestle individually with a multitude of issues. Determining how best to live in this world is, in my humble opinion, the reason you all get up and put aside the newspapers and the coffee and the bowls of cereal and get dressed and come here on a Sunday morning to spend time together when you could be at home relaxing after a hard week. I hope we come in here to hear from each other and learn how best to live this mystery we call life. That's why I do this. I think that's why most of you do this, if not all of you. And that's my hope. So if that's the reason we gather, then perhaps we should, allow our minds to expand a little more with this idea of changing the first principle. If we consider the worth and dignity of every being, we are forced to consider what that word means. What is a being? And you may not all come to the same conclusion even on that, because the word will surely mean different things to different people. And the First Principle Project fully acknowledges this. It's designed to broaden our thinking. Some people would consider the planet that we live on, Mother Earth, to be a being. Not just an ecosystem, but actually something that's alive. And all the life on this planet conspires together to create something, to be something. Some would consider insects to be beings. And when Jancy and I went up to the Garrison Institute last month, to the UU Buddhist convocation, one of the things they told us right off the bat was, please, 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 if you have food, bring it down here in the kitchen. Don't eat food in your rooms. Don't leave it in your rooms, because we use no insecticide here at all. So if you keep it all clean, you don't have problems with rodents and insects. Keep it down in the kitchen. They did this as a deliberate acknowledgement of a value of life. Some of us, that whole notion that we're not going to use insecticides, pesticides, we're not going to use rodent traps, that may sound silly. This is a deeply held conviction by people that look at life in a very unique way in our society. That doesn't mean everyone has to believe that. They don't insist that you believe it when you come or go. But they tell you, here's what we do. And so we will each decide for ourselves when we encounter things like this. But it certainly did make you stop and think, if nothing else, that someone had that kind of a conviction. As you wrestle with the notion of treating all beings with respect, assuming that you do choose to wrestle with that, then so many things you take for granted suddenly aren't so easy. Suppose, for instance, your house had mice in it, and you decided that, you know, they carry germs, they're chewing on the wires, I've got to get rid of them. But what are you going to do to get rid of them? Are you going to use a poison that causes them intense pain before they die? Will you use a glue trap so that they get stuck on it and then they suffer terror for hours? Will you use a mouse trap because that's actually quick and painless most of the time if it works right? But then again, it may not. And what about traps that just catch them and don't kill them? Then you're going to release them. Well, where are you going to release them? Who are you going to release them on to? Okay, these are all tough questions. They're unpleasant if you think that a mouse should be treated with worth and dignity. Should an animal be tortured or terrorized for your benefit, to keep your house clean, to keep your wires intact? Does a mouse warrant any consideration? Now, these are not silly questions. You may think they are. You may think that is just beyond stupid. And fair enough. But they do go to the core of everything. What is it to be alive in a multi-species world? And how do we interact with the other life here? Those are important questions. They go to the core of, how do I best live my life? The core of why we're here, I hope, on a Sunday. There is no question that humans have viewed animals as more merely raw materials, perhaps co-workers, although generally more slave-like than a co-worker, perhaps as a machine or a source of food. They've been used to move heavy objects from point A to point B throughout history, and often those heavy objects are us. They are used to pull plows and wagons and weapons, and in fact they have been weaponized. They were used to carry supplies and in some case armed. In World War II, several countries tried to use dogs as weapons, including the United States. The U.S. scheme was never used, but the Soviet Union did actually come up with a way of putting bombs on the back of dogs with a triggering device, a stick coming up the back, and they trained the dogs to run under tanks, not under the treads, but a tank has treads on each side and then it's elevated in the middle, and they would train dogs to go under there. And when they did that, the trigger would go off and blow up. How do you train a dog to do that? That's the only place you give a dog food. So they would get tanks, put the food under the tanks, and that's the only place they could get food. Now, in theory, this is a great idea, said the Soviets. We can just have a bunch of dogs die and blow up tanks. It's a win-win situation. Problem was, when you get a dog into a combat situation where the bombs are going off and the bullets are flying and it's chaos and noisy and scary, the dogs jump back to their loving trainers and blew them up. Sometimes they did do what they were supposed to. There were some successful attacks. And once the Germans figured out what was going on, they started targeting the dogs immediately. And then there was actually battles over retrieving the dead dogs because the Soviets didn't want the Germans to see what they had come up with. And when the Germans did get a hold of them and found out what they were doing, they issued a shoot all dogs on sight order as they invaded the Soviet Union. And every time they went into a village, they killed all the dogs because dogs had become weaponized. Now I'm going to lose it. Okay, in World War I, 8.5 million humans died, military personnel, and almost that much civilians. 16 million people died. At that time, war had entered a new phase of horrificness. Prior to that, the Napoleonic Wars, the Civil War, the weapons simply didn't have the capacity to kill with such efficiency as they did in World War I. And in World War I, people were just blown away, not literally, but mentally, by the sheer destructive power of these new weapons. We entered a whole new phase of death in World War I. And if you think about this, 8.5 million military personnel died. That number is just beyond comprehension. 8 million horses died fighting this war. 1 million dogs died. Other animals that were used were carrier pigeons. They actually have a monument in England to all the animals that died in World War I. Now, obviously they didn't enlist. Try to imagine what it's like to be an animal in that situation, never mind be a human. So, of course, not only do we have the horrible deaths from the military and how we use them in that sense, there are the animals that are tortured throughout their lives to be our food. I've spoken about this in the past. I'm not going to spend much time on it now. Just rest assured, if you saw what happened to the animals who become your food in the stores, who lay those eggs, who provide the milk, who become the meat that you eat, you would probably feel very guilty. And we are all, and I include myself in this, complicit in keeping this little secret buried. We really don't want to know. And if you wanted to know, it'd be very easy to find out. The movies are on Netflix. Lists and lists of them showing what happens to these animals. Dare you go watch them? Dare you? But we close our eyes and ignore it because we want our meat, we want our cheese, we want our milk. And so the animals suffer at our expense, or for our contentment, I should say. So in one sense, when we change this first principle wording, nothing changes. After all, you can ignore it. Everyone can ignore it. All the UUs can ignore it if they want. As I said before, there is no UU principal police that come around and make sure you honor all life, that you view all beings as having worth and dignity. That's the cynical way of looking at it. But the process of making the change to the wording, or at least proposing the change, might be transformative for some people. Having to face questions like, what is a being? Do we really believe in that interconnected web of all existence? Do animals have worth and dignity? And if so, which animals? Do we draw the line at insects or germs or viruses or what? How do we interact in this world full of life? If we ask these questions, they force us to look at how we live. They question our assumptions. Furthermore, such a change in this wording is not something that occurs quickly. It takes place over years. It's already been going on for a couple of years, and it will take more. And during that time, hopefully, there is plenty of consideration and thought. If 15 congregations, and there are 4 now, vote to support this change in the wording, Then, at the next General Assembly, there will be a vote of all the congregations, all the delegates. And what they vote on is not changing the wording. What they vote on is establishing a 2-year study commission to look at this proposal. And during those 2 years, this committee will decide if that's the exact wording they want to use, if they perhaps want to change it in some way. They will come up with the final proposal that will be voted on. And after that, at General Assembly, the congregations will vote on what that 2-year study group has come up with. And it might be different wording. We don't know, because it hasn't happened yet. I think this process would be a worthy one. We could be one of those 15 sponsoring congregations that allows this thing to go the next step, to establish the 2-year study commission. This is one of those times that a small church in southern Tennessee could leave a big mark. What say you? The amendment as written right now reads this way: we, and if we were to propose it, it would read, we, the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tullahoma, do hereby call on the General Assembly of the UUA to omit every person and replace with every being in Article 2, Principles and Purposes of the UUA bylaws. It's just that simple and just that potentially powerful. I will close with one more quote from their documents from the First Principle Project. Why change the first principle? A changed first principle affirms explicitly and more powerfully what many Unitarian Universalists already hold to be true, that all individuals of any species merit our compassionate consideration, and that because they are too part of this beautiful whole, they have worth and dignity. The goal of any version of the first principle is not to keep the circle of compassion small until each gets their share of dignity or compassion. We are called to extend the circle, each working to deepen their faith in the inherent worth and dignity of all. Though humans evolved both genetically and culturally to have an anthropocentric bias to choose the well-beings of humans over other species, we also evolved mechanisms to extend compassion beyond our own self-interests. Our own family, our own tribe, our own community, or our own species. Changing the first principle guides us to work in the world together for the betterment of all. May it be so.